Hello, everybody, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 5 of A Conversation with Cometan. Today, I am coming to you with a major Astronist Mechanism explanation video. I did one of these last season, and I wanted to do another one this season to explore the latest major Astronist Mechanism, which is number 4. For those who don't know, a major Astronist mechanism is a diagram that I sort of sometimes create, not that frequently, maybe one a year, for example. And it's just a way for me to express my ideas and beliefs regarding Astronist salvation and astroeschatology, astrosoteriology. It's just a way for me to get across visually and diagrammatically some of these very complex ideas. It's also just sort of an expression as well of my Astronist belief. And sometimes, you know, I don't have that inspiration to create a major Astronist mechanism. A lot goes into creating one. So there has to be enough sort of content for there to be a major Astronist mechanism, if you know what I mean, in order to make something new, a new type of mechanism. Anyway, so this year I created Major Astronist Mechanism 4, and I wanted to do a little bit of an explanation video to sort of explore what I was meaning when I created this earlier in the year. So here we are. You should be able to see the major Astronist mechanism here. I will move around, I think, or try to. And obviously, of course, try to zoom in at any time as well. So let's get started. Now, the fourth major Astronist mechanism, as you'll be able to see here, is titled The Chronology of Transcension. The reason why I chose that title is because primarily this mechanism looks at the sort of temporal dimensions of transcension, the sequences of what is prophesied to occur regarding transcension, which is the Astronist form of salvation, for those who don't know that. This mechanism was published on the 9th of September 2022, so it's still, you know, it's probably one of the most recent publications from the institution right now. So it's, you know, this is hot off the press, Astronist ideas. Some of them you will have seen before in the previous mechanism. Some of them are new, and also some of them have been reworked as well, or repackaged, I suppose, some of these ideas. So let's start really in this sort of top left-hand corner. So we've looked at the title. Let's look at the sort of components of transcension. Now, this is something that, you know, it's quite interesting, because one of the things that I've really been doing a lot in my writing of the Astrodoxy, for those who don't know, I'm writing a new treatise right now. It is called the Astrodoxy. It follows on from the first Astronist treatise, which was the Omnidoxy. And I'm sort of in the middle of that right now. So this mechanism is a production, really, or a product of the knowledge, the writings that are taking place for the Astrodoxy. And one of the things that I've been looking at very, very deeply is transcension and all the various different aspects of transcension. And one of these things was, one of the ways that I found helpful to do this was to create what I call, and I put them in brackets there, ability doctrines. So these are essentially pertaining to what transcension can do for humanity and what it can't do, what transcension is and what transcension isn't. And they all end with ability at the end. So, of course, that then pertains to a sort of something that they can do or something that it can't do, essentially. That's what I wanted to try and achieve with creating these ability doctrines. Overall, I call these the components of transcension, all these various different ones, because they all play an important part. Now, I'm not going to go through every single one, because this video would probably be 6 hours long, like my astrosoteriology video was last year. But let's just look at some of the more pertinent ones. And I'm going to zoom in on this doctrine here, which is what I call evitability. Of course, that is the opposite, the inverse of inevitability. Evitability, as I've written there, pertains to the doctrine that transcension is neither guaranteed to occur nor to complete, nor to sort of come to completion, if you will. And that's really important. That's a really central doctrine about transcension, is that, you know, if humanity doesn't harness the scope that we have to achieve transcension, transcension won't occur. It depends on humanity, but also at the same time, even if humanity does everything we possibly can to achieve transcension, that also doesn't guarantee transcension either. So the evitability doctrine sort of puts transcension in this spot where nothing is guaranteed about it. Either its occurrence, either humanity's embarkation upon transcension, nor transcension's completion. Even if humanity does every single thing possible to achieve transcension, that doesn't mean that transcension will actually occur. And so this is quite a difficult doctrine for maybe astronists to digest, because it can kind of make you feel a little bit sort of not have much motivation to embark upon something like transcension that is going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, with possibly that sort of ever-present possibility that it may not even come to completion. But I think that being honest about the nature of transcension and the fact that it is evitable, that it is not guaranteed, it is not inevitable, it is not inevitable to occur. This makes transcension quite different from some other forms of salvation. I'm just thinking about the sort of the Christian idea of salvation, where primarily if humanity does as it's told, which is in the Christian view of what is good, then you will achieve salvation. So there is an element in Christian salvation of this sort of inevitability, as long as you believe in Christ, for example. In transcension, in Astronism, we don't have that guarantee. We can do everything we possibly can to achieve transcension, but even then, even if we followed every step, it's not necessarily going to come to completion or to the full fruition of transcension. Okay, so the evitability doctrine is really important and is probably the most important component as that you can see on this mechanism. There's many others. You've got the maneuverability of transcension, which is there at the top, which is the doctrine that transcension can progress as well as regress. You know, humanity can move forward with transcension. We can do things that are good. We can harness scope for transcension, but it can also be reversed. That is reversible. You know, just because we've made 2 steps forward in transcension doesn't mean that we might take 2 steps back later on. So again, it's just trying to demonstrate the nature of this form of salvation, how it's very different from other forms of salvation. And these different ability doctrines just highlight some of the various different aspects of the nature of transcension. I think also as well, one of the things was the superability. I think this was interesting. I want to zoom in on this. The superability of transcension. You know, the doctrine that transcension can be brought to completion. This is really important. We're not saying that transcension is guaranteed to come to completion. Not saying that, because of course that would defy the evitability doctrine that we've just spoken about. But what we are saying with the superability doctrine is that transcension can be brought to completion. That is to say that it is possible for transcension to be brought to completion, whereas other people And I've spoken to people about this in discussions. They've sort of questioned that, can transcension even come to completion? Is this going to be too hard for humanity to achieve? The superability doctrine kind of, I would say, smooths the edges of some of these more harsh doctrines, like the evitability doctrine, by saying, well, it still can be completed. There is still a possibility for its completion. Okay, so when you get a chance to look at the Major Astronist Mechanism 4, please just take a look at some of these different components of transcension. And these should all, in theory, slot in together and work well together. They should all interconnect and work and sort of like a machine, like a mechanism. They should all work well together. Not one of these ability doctrines should overlap or sort of contradict another ability doctrine in order for obviously transcension to be coherent. So I think that's a really good way of just breaking down the various different aspects of transcension. And hopefully as time goes on, I'll create more ability doctrines in order to sort of build an even clearer picture of what transcension is. So let's move on now to, because if I zoom out, obviously the main part of this mechanism is this huge sort of curve that's got sort of two parts. You've got this curve here. Now, obviously that is pertaining to the chronology of transcension that you as you can see, and we're going to look at this, but it starts off at birth, then it goes from into adulthood, childhood, adulthood, and then death, and then obviously the afterlife in the overworld after that. So that's what the major Astronist mechanism is trying to show, is this sort of upward as well, lifting upwards. That's really important. The imagery is really important in the Astronist mechanisms. I've not structured the mechanism in this way for nothing. I've done it with a purpose, and one of those purposes is to show that upwards is good, downwards is not so good. And of course the coloring as well, make sure you have a look at the coloring. All the colors are coordinated. For example, this sort of lighter purple color, sort of verging on pink color, is transcension. It's pertaining to progression in transcension, or anything about transcension. The overworld color is sort of that darker purple. The controversion color is, of course, the red color there. The green color are generally used to mean sort of earth. I generally mean that to sort of mean the terrestrial world, if you will. And of course, also, I've used sort of a starry background for the top half there. So that obviously pertains to outer space. So the background pertains to the settings, and then the different colors used pertain to different sort of aspects of the transcensional process, I would say. So you can use the color coding as a way to sort of navigate this mechanism. So we've had a look at the components of transcension. Let's go down now to the sort of bottom left-hand corner. This is really interesting. So you've got here sort of it's fairly brief actually, and hopefully maybe in mechanism 5 or one after, I'm going to do a full mechanism on the sidereal economy, because that's really important. That is how we achieve transcension, how transcension is to be managed so that we can achieve it. And I've sort of done a very basic outline of the sidereal economy here. You've got on the left-hand corner, on the left-hand side there, you've got cosmic limitation, and you've got all these different symptoms of cosmic limitation coming off of that main idea of limitation. You've got disease, being earthbound, nescience, fear, suffering, mortality, decay, all these different causes, symptoms of limitation. And then obviously you've got the sidereal economy there, which is the sort of uplifting from these limitations, getting us out of these limitations and using scope to do that. And then also on the other side, the right hand side here, you've got universal unlimitation, and some of the sort of benefits of that are, for example, the fulfillment of the sidereal vision. Please go and take a look at that. You can find about that online, I think, or maybe not. Maybe that's in the Astrodoxy, actually. You have to wait to learn a little bit more about the sidereal vision. But you've got infinite consciousness, ideas about divinosis, which is a sort of Astronist version of theosis, sort of unity with God, for example, at the sort of unlimitation stage. And then you've also got the role of the controversive nature in the sidereal economy there that I've explored, where I've said, you know, limitedness, aversion to transcension will lead to degradation. So this is a sort of very basic outline of the sidereal economy. I really want to do more on the sidereal economy, like I said. But for this stage, I think that this is quite a nice basic outline of it for people, just to give them an introduction to it. So I think that's really helpful. And then related to that, obviously, is the actual process of transcension. So here I've done it essentially the reason why, you might be wondering why I've split this sort of curve upwards, why I've split it in two. The reason why is because the top curve is to do with the origins. It's to do with humanity as a whole. It's to do with our species as a whole. It's to do with how we as a collective species will attain transcension. Whereas the bottom curve is about us as individuals, how we will achieve astrosis, our journey into the overworld once we've undergone cosmization, which is another word for death in Astronism. So that's why I've split this curve in two, to sort of show that there are two aspects of transcension that are taking place simultaneously. There is the sort of collective transcension, also called the specific transcension, meaning the transcension of the species, but then also the individual personal transcension, which is, of course, the journey to astrosis. What I also wanted to show by this as well, especially when we get to the top here, is that eventually these two sort of simultaneous aspects of transcension eventually merge into one, and what takes place in each of these aspects has an effect on the actual overall condition of transcension at the end, whether we actually achieve it or not at the end. So that's the reason why I split those two. And then, of course, you can see here how the origins of humanity, so looking at the scope of man, controversion, some of these ideas you may be familiar with if you've done a little bit of research on astronism. The very sort of basic aspects of the sideresis. Surasiya is something you will not have seen yet. Surasiya, that word there, the fourth one along. That is something new that is being developed as part of the Astrodoxy, so you will have to wait a little bit longer. But I did want to just put a little bit of a preview. This is kind of a little preview, I suppose, of some of the ideas that are being explored in the Astrodoxy, essentially. So I like to give a little bit of a preview of these things by including them in the major Astronist Mechanism, simply because I can get these major Astronist Mechanisms published more quickly than a treatise, because it's going to be a couple more years until the treatise is actually complete. So you're looking at sort of, we'll start with this. Yeah, we'll start with the species one version first. So you've got Surasiya, and then you've got the Twilight Tide, which is obviously our decision to embark upon transcension. Then you've got the Great Departation, which is where we're leaving the Earth for transcension. You've got Eurasteria, which is a sort of prophesied astronomical event that will sort of act as the sort of harbinger. It will herald the grand world, and then obviously you've got the grand world at the top there, which is sort of the, I mean, I describe it here, an eschatological vision of an interstellar human future with the completion of transcension on the horizon. So that's the grand world. So that's right at the top there. And then, of course, for the individual side, I think this is really important. To explore how transcension affects every aspect, every stage of life, from birth to childhood, adulthood to death. And throughout this time, of course, there are things like the Terarch, which is a sudden apocalyptic extinction of the human species, which is possible, which will then obviously lead to, you know, the degradation of humanity and us not being able to achieve transcension, or just our own aversion to transcension will lead to our degradation there as well. So that's another reason why I've included those two red curves going downwards. Sometimes as well, you do sort of, when you sort of are exploring the major Astronist mechanism, because you can get it on astronism.com for free, obviously. It's a PDF file, so you've got to kind of zoom in sometimes, because some of the text is sometimes very, very small, so you will have to kind of zoom in and look at what I've written there, because I have to try and fit it all in, you see, so sometimes it can be quite difficult. So yeah, so that's sort of the two controversion curves going downwards. I've also included on this mechanism, which I don't know if I included this last time, but sort of little boxes here. And I've tried to give them different colors in order to demonstrate that they are kind of just little miscellaneous pieces of information. For example, I've included a new disciplines box here, which the Astrodoxy, as I've said, is introducing a number of new subdiscipline branches of analepsology, which is the study of transcension. So all these different new disciplines I've wanted to just include as part of the major Astronist Mechanism 4, just to get them out there, just to sort of introduce people to them. Anyway, sorry to sort of go on off a tangent there. So yeah, so you go through life, you've got these different stages of astrosis, specifically in the individual version of it, of transcension. Then you've got cosmization, which is, of course, death. I've included a sort of big skeleton, skull with sort of crossbones to sort of demonstrate death there. And then, of course, you go into the overworld, which has been really nice to be able to explore as part of this mechanism, and to just to show that upward maneuver, that upward movement that the overworld is, and all these different stages of it. I'm not going to go through them all because, again, you know, it'll probably be such a long video. If I did, I'd have to explain the whole soteriology in order to do that. But just take a look yourselves. You know, there are these different stages. One thing that is pretty new is this idea of the apagoration. That is a new thing in the Astrodoxy, and it is the idea that the manipulation of scope to effectuate transcension is sort of achieved through absorption into the cosmic material world. And what I mean by that is that essentially that is pertaining really to a sort of cosmosis, but maybe pre-cosmosis. It's immersion into the astronomical world, essentially. And I've spoken about this before, how, you know, you can achieve that mystically, intellectually, but also physically as well, spiritually, possibly as well. That's what apagoration is. It's just focusing again on that sort of immersion into the astronomical world that transcension is teaching, that we have to go out into the astronomical world, that we have to sort of embark upon this process of transcension in order to immerse ourselves into that world, and that there will be sort of a manipulation of scope after that by the deceased, who can manipulate scope to affect transcension. Okay, that's what the overworld is talking about here. It's talking about how the spirits of the souls of those who have deceased can still manipulate scope to affect transcension. Okay, that they can change transcension, they can help us achieve transcension. So when someone's gone, that doesn't necessarily, when someone's died, doesn't necessarily mean that they can't still help with transcension. Okay, so that's what apagoration means. It's sort of an afterlife belief that the souls of people, the consciousness of human beings, can still help us to effectuate change in the real world, in the physical world, and can still help us through our transcension. And the way that we engage with those souls in the overworld is through our absorption into the astronomical world, our connection to it. That's how we connect with them, of course, because they're in the overworld, which is, of course, outer space for people who don't realize that. So there are these different aspects, there's these different stages of the overworld, which eventually lead to cosmosis for the individual. But before we can do that, there is this idea of the apagoration, which again is a new idea that's part of the Astrodoxy. It is this idea of there being an embargo. It's the embargo of cosmized souls and consciousnesses in the overworld. Now, this is the idea that these souls, these consciousnesses are embargoed until transcension comes to completion, and that they cannot be released into sort of unlimitedness until transcension comes to completion. This is the point. This is the embargo. This is why it's really important. The apagoration, or the embargo of cosmized souls, is the point at which transcension, sort of collective transcension, the transcension of humanity, conjoins with the transcension of the individual. Okay, because the individual can get so far on their own, all the way up to this point, just past the apagoration. These are things you can do on your own. You don't necessarily need transcension to do that. But the point at which transcension sort of controls your individual fate is when we need transcension to open this embargo. We need it to open that embargo for the species, for the whole species. And this is the point at which transcension becomes essential to individual destiny, I suppose, the individual final destination of the individual. And that's what we call apagoration. It's the embargo of all cosmic souls in the overworld until transcension has come to completion. That's why we put such an emphasis in Astronism on transcension, because if we don't complete transcension, then these souls in the overworld are going to be trapped there, are going to be embargoed there forever. And then the cosmos is going to end, because remember, they are still bound by cosmic laws. When the cosmos ends, they will go into Telluria, which is this part here, which is the grey curve that's going downwards. That is sort of nothingness. It is sort of this idea of nihility, but it's more specific to transcension, and we call it Telluria. So that's where these two lines really kind of merge together, and it's sort of a block that is placed on individual fate by transcension. So transcension is essential. We must complete transcension in order to free these embargoed souls. Okay, so that's the whole point of it. And so you can take a look for yourselves, the idea of the embargo theory. It sort of explains it a little bit more. And then the sort of subsequent ideas that have emerged from that. So yeah, that's sort of the main part, really, I suppose, is sort of this upward curve that is, I suppose, demonstrating sort of, like I said, the individual form of transcension and then the collective form of transcension. And it's introducing some of these, not all of them are new ideas. Some of them, probably most of them, are ideas that you may have found in the third major Astronist mechanism. Okay. But they've just been presented in a different way, packaged in a different way. You know, I've not included all the different ideas either. I've also been a little bit more sort of selective as to which ideas I'm going to include in this mechanism, which ideas I think are most relevant to this mechanism. And so these are the ones that I chose. So take a look at the embargo theory. It's really interesting. It's something that is brand new. And that's something that's great, isn't it, about Astronism, is that it's constantly changing. You know, you don't really get this as much in sort of religions that have been around for a long time. You know, you don't get sort of someone coming along saying, right, there's this new doctrine, there's this new idea that we have to incorporate into the belief system. You know, you don't get that as much in things like Christianity, whereas Astronism, there are new ideas, new beliefs, new doctrines that are emerging all the time, especially right now, because I'm in the middle of creating the Astrodoxy. So there are lots of new ideas that are emerging from that. And this embargo theory is one of those ideas. So just at the top there, in this pink box, before we get on to the very, very top, which is about the ultimation, let's look at the pink box here. So soteriology is the collection of values set forth in Astronism that stand in accordance with the code of ethics of transcension. So soteriology is essentially the morality of transcension. It's what transcension sees as good, essentially. And obviously, this has a very big effect on whether the individual is going to achieve astrosis and then eventually cosmosis, and also on whether transcension is actually going to take place. So soteriology is the morality of transcension. It is looking at what transcension sees as good and bad, essentially. So quite important, really, to consider. So I wanted just to include that as a little box. I'll probably do a lot more on that later on, because, you know, that's a pretty new idea. Earlier on, you know, I flirted with the ideas of amoralism quite early on in Astronism, and which doesn't mean immoral. It's amoral. It's sort of a removal, or sort of I would say a sort of not a removal per se, but sort of a sort of distancing from the idea of morality. Whereas, you know, I've sort of changed my mind now, and I've sort of transcension's developed more, and I've sort of got a clearer picture now, and this idea of soteriology has emerged. But it's interesting, isn't it, how, you know, Astronism and my sort of approaches to Astronism are changing all the time, and soteriology is just one little example of that. So just two last things to look at as part of this explanation of the major Astronist Mechanism 4. Another new thing is this idea here, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, which is the Saurusian rhythm. Now, to understand the Saurusian rhythm, you're going to have to understand a little bit about the Saurusia. The Saurusia, as I mentioned earlier, is a new contribution to Astronism as part of the Astrodoxy. It is a ritual of recommitment to transcension, essentially. And it is it is the central Astronist ritual, essentially. And it is this idea of rejuvenating scope through this ritual of Surasiya. Now, the Surasian rhythm is a sort of diagram that I've created here in order to demonstrate how this sort of regeneration takes place. So if we start with the Surasiya, so you've performed the Surasiya, and then obviously that goes on to promulgation. We're going anti-clockwise here, by the way, just notice that. We're going anti-clockwise. So it's promulgation, so that means spreading the transcension. So once you have refilled yourself with scope, you've rejuvenated yourself with scope, your heart and mind with scope and astronality and afflation and other confirmants, you can then go about promulgating transcension. Then, of course, that leads to suranization, okay, which is the progressing of transcension. So when you have promulgated transcension to different people, that is going to result in the progression of transcension. People are going to take action from this. When they know about transcension, they're going to take action. They're going to try and progress transcension. Okay, so by the gradual process of the limited parts of the self, okay, that's what progressing in transcension means. And the word that we use to do that is suranization. Of course, the limitedness of humanity prevails at the moment. We have this tendency towards limitation, distractions of the world. I've written there procrastination. I may, you may not know this, but, I can procrastinate just as much as anyone else. We have this sort of issue in sort of the human mind, this limited mind that we have to procrastinate, to go against what may be best for us. This is all encompassed by the idea of controversion. Okay, so even though you've rejuvenated your scope, you've promulgated transcension, transcension is progressing. Human beings have this tendency to go back to limitation, and then of course that comes around again to the Surasiya. That's why we need to rejuvenate. That's why we need to rejuvenate scope. So when we are, pushed down with this limitation on our shoulders, and we can't see a way out, and we need a little bit of guidance. That's why Surasiya is really important, because it allows us to rejuvenate our ideas, our mind with scope. So that's the Surasian rhythm. It shows how essentially scope is rejuvenated, how it's then sort of spread around, how then we come into sort of limit ourselves again because of our sort of limited nature, our controversive nature, and then we come back around again to try to rejuvenate that. So the Surasiya is a way of rejuvenating scope in our lives when we've sort of limited ourselves again after rejuvenation. So, sorry. So the Surasian rhythm is really interesting, and it just gives us that way to kind of, I suppose, explore this idea of scopic rejuvenation, to rejuvenate our belief in transcension, our motivation really to achieve transcension. The Surasian rhythm, I'll just read this out just as a little bit of a description right in the bottom right hand corner there. The Surasian rhythm describes the innate human tendency to be led away from transcension and the need for the regular sort of re-establishment, for its regular re-establishment through the ritual of the Surasiya, which literally produces new scope through a process of eponymization. So you can sort of forget some of the words, eponymization, maybe, it's quite a technical word, but just think of it as a rejuvenation, essentially. And that's what the Surasiya is supposed to do. It's supposed to help people in rejuvenating their scope. And then, of course, you've got this little box here, which is eschatology, which actually more relates to the overworld. That's why I've put it in the same color as the overworld. It's essentially just referring to doctrines about sort of the afterlife, but before the end of existence, before the end of the cosmos, essentially. Okay. So that I think I've sort of mainly covered sort of all of those different aspects. Let's just have a look at the top now. So we've spoken a lot about how transcension is achieved, this sort of process to achieve it. Of course, on top of that, at the very end of transcension, there is what we call the ultimation. Now, the ultimation is this sort of infinite existence. It is this infinite sort of consciousness, I suppose, in the universe. And it is the ultimate goal of transcension, essentially. And it is equivalent to salvation. So when other religions talk about salvation, we talk about ultimation in Astronism. So there's different aspects of the ultimation, which you can, that's why I've put these little keywords there. Obviously, transcosmization is really important. I've really put a big emphasis on that at this point, just to show that, you know, escaping this cosmic limitedness is the purpose of transcension. That's the goal of transcension. And then the ultimation is the reward of transcension, I would say. I would sort of split it in that sort of way. And then you've got the sidereunium here, which is, of course, all about the connection between transcension, myself, and astronists also being in a covenant with the divine, with God, to achieve transcension. And this is something, again, that is fairly new. It is a fairly new idea. It is not something that we sort of saw much in the Omnidoxy, really. And it is this idea that, yes, astronists do have the Astronist Institution, you know, the Astronist people do have a covenant with God to achieve transcension. And establishing that covenant is part of my role as the founder of Astronism and the sort of leader of the Astronists. And this covenant is what I refer to as the sidereunium. It is the sidereunium. It is trying to bring to completion transcension. And the transcension reciprocates by bringing to fruition the sidereine covenant, which is another word for sidereunium. So that's at the top there, just to show, again, why transcension needs to take place. It's sort of explaining why. Then we've got divine intervenience here, which is, of course, the idea that the divine is, or God is, intervening in the world. I'm going to do a mechanism on astronist theology and analytic theology. I'm going to do a mechanism on that. I'm going to write a lot more about that, but the idea is that the divine is intervening in the cosmos, in the limited cosmos, in order to get humanity to ascend to the stars, essentially, in order to eventually unite with the divine. Okay, so that's what divine intervenience means, and I've sort of done these arrows coming down into the world to demonstrate that. And Surosia, this ritual of the Surosia, is the connection between humanity and God, and the intervenience. That's how God intervenes in the world. It is through this ritual of the Surosia. That's how we receive scope. Scope, obviously, is one of the three confirmants as well. Don't forget that. That's why I've included these three different coloured, arrows here. I've given them different colors because they each represent three main confirmants, one of them being scope, of course. And then finally, just to end this explanation of the mechanism, you've got divinity and sidereunity. So divinity and sidereunity, I'll start off with divinity. So divinity is what all creation subsists within and proliferates from, while also divinity exists independently from its limited creations. Divinity intervenes in its cosmoses, but does not interact or manifest except in its bestowal of scope for the purpose of uniting to it its preferred sapient beings at the end of time. So that's referring to the process of divine intervenience, but also how that connects to scope and then obviously transcension. Sidereality is the property that allows sapient beings to escape their limited natures by ascending through the astronomical world and to the ultimation of divinity beyond. Sidereality is the state, fact, and quality of being with scope, and thus being on the journey to divinosis by way of transcension. So sidereality refers to sort of the condition of the human species, really, in sort of contradistinction to the condition of maybe other animals on this planet that don't have scope like we do. They are not able to ascend to transcension and divinosis. They're not able to do that. They don't have the scope to do that, but we do, and so that is referred to as sidereality. Okay. So that's really interesting. Those two concepts are really important. I'm going to finish up now because I think there's so much to take in there, and I don't want to sound kind of like overload you guys, but I've probably already done that. Just take a look at the new Major Astronist Mechanism for the chronology of transcension. It is on astronism.com for free. You can take a look at it. It's really interesting. It's another progression of Astronist ideas. It's a sort of production of Astronist ideas. It is a product of the Astrodoxy, some of these new ideas that are emerging, doctrines that are emerging. And I think that in a way, it's demonstrating the sort of progression that transcension is on, that journey the journey of that astronism is on. I've been speaking too long now. I'm getting my words muddled up. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I hope you've been managed to sort of keep up with all these different aspects. I know that the major Astronist mechanisms are really hard. They're really hard to create and also sometimes quite overwhelming to be able to understand because there's a lot going on. What I would recommend to you guys is that when you're looking at the major Astronist mechanism, look at it in the different parts that I've shown you. You know, don't try and sort of take it all in at once. Try and look at the different parts of it, the different sections of the mechanism, rather than trying to absorb it all at the same time. That's what I do anyway. When I sort of return to looking at these mechanisms, I sort of look at the different sections of the mechanism and try to focus in and sort of explain what I was trying to say in each of the sections. So I'll stop talking now and I'll let you guys get on with your day. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of A Conversation with Cometan, guys, and I will see you in the next episode, which will be episode 6. Wow, we're really getting through this season so far. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.